Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sharia Way Read Aloud. Book club container. Whoops. I was just listening to the read aloud. Anyways, um, yes, this container takes place every Sunday at 8:30 p.m. Louisiana time, and today I'll be holding space for, and we'll be holding space for um, a discussion and exegesis, a breakdown of chapter 4 in the section titled Name or the Mysticism of Sound, and the chapter is called Name. And yes, I just want to, before we dive in, I want to thank those who are here live because I feel like it contributes so much to the container. And thank you for being here as part of this discussion. And I guess I kind of want to start off by taking us a little bit outside the book, and maybe we can like weave our way back into the content of the book. But I just kind of want to hold space for any reflections, um, anything that you've been positing on that came up for you upon reading to or listening to chapter 4. Um, and yeah, feel free to type in the chat or unmute yourself. I'm just wrapping up the chat now. I guess for me, Um, I'll name something and maybe we can start there. One thing that came up for me early on in the chapter, um, oh dang, okay, wait, I just saw that Nobu wrote something in the chat. So I'll come back to what I said because I have it written down. Nobu writes, I'm tingling on quote, mastery requiring knowledge and knowledge requiring names. Do you want to say more? Not yet. Okay, cool. Yes, that is actually one of the paragraphs that I did put a star around that actually instantly made me think of this concept around namelessness, which is like not a concept at all. It is an acknowledgement. I would say namelessness itself is like acknowledging that some aspects of reality, some aspects of the world, um, and some aspects of our human experience even go beyond the scope of like naming. And I think it most commonly shows up as like when people are feeling something or sensing something or hoping to communicate something. And in that, they lose their words because, well, I'll ask y'all, why do you think that happens in those instances where people lose their words or lose their footing in communication? Okay, I'm going to read out some of the reflections in the chat. Anna says, a great question. Thank you. Nova says, I feel like truth is far more complex than words. Oh, I agree. Nova goes on to say, reality is far more complex than our dimensionality allows for. Yes. And I think for me, that really what you're saying really textures um, kind of my reasoning for why I feel like namelessness is so vast, and not vast in the sense that it takes up a lot of space, vast in the sense that it like presupposes space or is the thing that actually like is the medium that contains space, which can be kind of vast and meta to say, but I think that that's what I'm hoping to capture by saying that. um Adam says, I'm thinking of the awestruck flavor versus like quote the colliding of ideas variety. Huh. I'm thinking of the awestruck flavor versus, okay, I see what you mean. I see what you mean. Like the awestruck namelessness and then the awestruck, then the like feeling of like there's like conflicting ideas that causes that dam between communication.
Yeah, exactly. Like that variety where there's not a word that could possibly add to what is happening. Like it's just like what, you're just in it. Versus like sometimes when the words won't come, when I think there's too many words actually, and they
Mhm.
crash into a big jumble and it just ends up being nameless. I don't think that's what you're talking about, but that kind of
Yeah.
the way you phrase that communication question made me think of that specific variety of like breakdown.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing that in because I think it can happen for many different reasons, and I think that you're capturing, like, 2 pretty salient reasons to me, or kind of, like, whys behind that happens when people's words kind of get jumbled. Um, yeah, so thank you for bringing that in because I think it has to do sometimes with a lexical thing, and then I think sometimes it has to do kinda like what you're saying with an energetic thing. Um, so yeah. Nobu says, "I feel like ideas that collide in n-dimensional space can be free in o-dimensional space, where o is greater than or vaster than, I'm assuming, n in this example." Ooh, I appreciate the mathematical, computational context because I think it actually like I think it yeah, kind of captures for me a little bit of what I was saying. There's a robot gif in the chat.
I think, yeah. Sorry to cut in. I was just gonna say what I felt from it was sort of like at some layer, it's happening.
Totally. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think sometimes there's just channels and flows of energy that, yeah, precipitate naming itself. Yeah, Adam says we are liberated somewhere. Ashe. Hey Gaia. Um, so I appreciate you guys kind of tackling that question. Um, where did I want to go with this? I'm holding space. I'm curious what's coming up for y'all as I fumble through the book really quickly.
I was just gonna say a bit about like um when words fail. And I am just like getting the sense that as I begin speaking at some point, at some point my words will fail me. um well, I think sometimes like the way that I experience things is like I'm experiencing them on like a really meta level. So like instead of like translating the energy into words, I feel like
Mhm.
even how I started off, where I was like, well, I'm going to start talking about how words are going to fail. And then I have a
Mhm.
feeling that in doing so, my words will actually fail. So I feel like
Mhm.
oftentimes, like, my experiential awareness of a moment is like actually translating more than like what I can say, if that makes sense.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think that makes total sense. And I guess what I'm hearing is like there are just there are not just, but there are somatic experiences that kind of like what we were saying to earlier, like allude and like go beyond what words can capture. But it still doesn't mean that we're not gonna try.
Oh, yeah. I mean, like, I wouldn't write poetry if I thought that it didn't matter, you know?
Ashe. Ashe. Yeah, I'm like, we wouldn't even be on this call right now. I feel like communication
Right.
and like there is something to it. Like that's kind of even what I get from this chapter is that there is something, some sort of alchemical charming that happens when something is named. But
Oh,
I
yeah.
also feel like before we can even speak to how that's maybe true, I think it's important to like, yeah, like set the context like we have been and speak to the reality that like, yeah, there's just some things that you can't touch with words. We can try and we can like dedicate swaths of art and poetry to it.
Mhm,
Um, but I don't think it ever means that the job is going to get done personally.
mhm, mhm.
Psychonaut says, thinking about what Nobu was saying the other day, again, about symbols and cosmic language or messages, still unpacking that whole chat. Yes. And Psychonaut, are you speaking to what was said in that Why Am I Like This container about hyperdimensional shapes? Okay. Do you want to share what you're still unpacking, or is it still in the suitcase for you?
I'm in the process of unpacking the suitcase, and I'm finding more suitcases inside of that suitcase. Um, I think mostly, and how it ties into this with like language, and I'm sort of thinking about like symbols, like language as symbols, and these shapes as different symbols as well, and creating or sort of mapping out that language and what it looks like. Because I don't really I think that's where the difficulty comes from, right? Is that we don't really understand the symbols that are coming to us, and it takes so long and so much energy to sort of translate that into symbols that we understand. So, trying to sort of map that out and create the the symbolism necessary for translating all of that, um, it's something else.
Totally. Yeah, and I feel as in relation to what you were saying that pre-symbolic reality. I feel like I'm just kind of giving a read here. I feel like in current time, pre-symbolic reality is finding its way into symbolic reality. And like earlier, we were talking in archetypal hour, which you guys should totally check out. We were talking about these bridges, these things that help us contextualize, help us fill in, help us color in the world of these hyperdimensional shapes. Um, and yeah, even trying to use poetry, trying to use symbology, reviving myth, which is something that I feel you talk about often, is I think part of that process. So yeah, actually, yeah, Adam is saying that it's a process. It definitely is. And I kind of want to go to paragraph number three in the text. And does anybody want to read paragraph number three? I mean, I can definitely read paragraph number three, but there's a reason why I want to bring us there. Okay, I'll read it. So, paragraph three reads the reason of people's greatness or humans' greatness is the scope of the knowledge. And I actually underlined the word knowledge or scratched it out and replaced it with the word gnosis a couple times in this chapter. So, instead of knowledge, I'm going to use gnosis. I hope that's okay. The reason of humans' greatness is the scope of their gnosis, with which they are gifted. All the mystery of which lies in their recognition of the differences between things and beings. This gives humanity superiority not only over all the creatures of earth, but it even makes them excel the angels, the hosts of heaven. And so I brought that in because I feel like it relates to kind of what Nobu talked about earlier. Let me scroll up something about knowledge, this interplay between knowledge. But I also feel like, yes, mastery requiring knowledge and knowledge requiring names. And this was a very complex chapter for me to read, namely because I think Hazrat Inyak just stuffs in so many different symbolic epithets. But I feel like also this act of scratching out the word knowledge and replacing it to gnosis for me felt very ceremonious in the sense that I don't think that people in humanity's greatness rests in head knowledge. And I think it actually alludes more to what we're speaking to is this ability to capture and marinate and maybe even set free symbolic interplay to make meaning of the world as opposed to staying boxed in by the symbols that we're using to make sense of reality, if that makes sense. So I want to kind of kick the question back to y'all. If this knowledge and this gnosis is what maybe kind of separates, to use Hazrat Inyat Khan's example, man from beast, um, how does naming things play into this for y'all, if at all? And y'all can, of course, as always, feel free to unmute.
I really love the switch to gnosis. It had such a nice, I don't know, hard to describe, but I just wanted to say how much I appreciate it, and I'm sitting with it.
Mm. Thank you for reflecting, Otto. Yeah, maybe before we go into the larger question, would you guys do the same thing? Or do you think that the word knowledge in this chapter can be replaced with gnosis as you understand it? And if so, why? That would be a great essay question, by the way, but anyways. I'm
I
gonna read
was,
some of the stuff in the chat. Oh, sorry. Go on.
I was just gonna be like, okay, English teacher. I love that question. It's really interesting because I actually like, so the word gnosis, I guess is like relatively new for me. Like I had never encountered that word before I joined the broom. And so this conversation is actually giving me a lot of perspective as to what it even is. Because I think that sometimes I think I might have like a preconception about the word that it feels like s- I'll be honest, a lot of times it feels like something that like I don't have access to or like that I can't formulate. Like I don't know why, but it feels like very like official. Like if you have spiritual gnosis, it means like I don't know. It's very interesting. Like um yeah, I'm not sure how to express what I'm saying, but I think that comparing it to knowledge is giving me a lot of perspective. Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask and see if mm, the way that it's described here in the book does knowing what you know about gnosis, and this can be for anyone too, including Anna, knowing what you know about the word gnosis and then knowing what you know about the word knowledge, which one, I guess, best fits the description that's being used in the text? Because I also feel like this, again, this dichotomy that's being created about the thing that separates creatures of the earth and like humans, and also even raises people to the ability to excel above angels. I'm like, that's more than something you can get in a book, which is what I relate knowledge to. So I wonder if it's the same for you all, if there's a delineation between the word knowledge and gnosis occurring for anyone. Mhm. Ooh, I want to read some of the stuff in the chat. Okay. Psychonaut said earlier, I think that a lot of people are too ready to not look at language as symbolic. They think of it as literal versus symbols, but it really is just a lot of symbolic references. Symbols as references, and language as literal or objective. Ashe. Julie echoes back experiential knowledge. Guy says that she's reading Twilight Language of the Nahual, the spiritual power of shamanic dreaming. Ashe. Reading that book title just gave me chills. Psychonaut has now climbed inside of the suitcase and it has closed behind him. I bid you well, my friend. Nobu says, I feel like names can help us to bridge between our experience and other people's experience, and they can change our perceptual frames and therefore our experience. But I don't feel like their experience itself. Ashe. Yeah, I'm going to continue reading some of the chat. Psychonaut shares some Proto-Indo-European roots of no, GNO, which directly correlates to the phrase to know. Gaia says, I'm where Anna is. Adam says, I hear what you're saying, Anna, and I would say, quote, inner knowing was the quote symbolic bridge that helped me with gnosis. Nobu says, I feel like gnosis to me is preconceptual knowing, and knowledge is conceptualized gnosis. Thank you for saying so. Julie says, yeah, I think because of the consensus of how knowledge is defined as heavy on the cerebral aspects of intelligence versus full body intelligence, which I feel gnosis points to. Ashe. Yeah, and I'd say I have to agree. I think that's why I was kind of called to like scratch out knowledge, because I'm like, at this point in my journey, I'm not approaching anything with just my head. And so to bold of Hazrat Inyat Khan to assume that that's where I was going. But curious curious if there's any other delineations coming up for y'all. Guy is saying this clicked for me. Do you want to say more? That's what Julie said. Ashe. Psychonaut says gnosis is specifically experiential knowledge in my experience. Yeah. Yeah, when I think of gnosis, I think of something that lives directly in my akash. That's like context specific, and that like after one particular context. For me, it's probably because I'm Mercury Day born, but after I can feel that part of my akash, like that part of truth can fill into multiple different circumstances, usually 3 circumstances. I'm like, oh, it's gnosis. At this point, it's wisdom for me to learn how to steer my ship in life. And I think that that's the thing with gnosis, is that it might not be something, the context in which gnosis, Anna says, and that's on Mercury, period. I don't think that every single circumstance is going to call for the same gnosis, but I do think that what's the word I'm looking for? Collection of gnoses and collection of experiential wisdom, I think amounts to gnosis. And then I think if you're like some of the people in the room who are like collecting different books of gnosis across different lineages, then yeah, then you have kind of, I would in my opinion say that that's gnoses, like books of knowledge. Um a pack of gnoses, exactly. Yeah, and guys saying gnosis is a new word in my vocabulary, so I'll have to get used to it, to using it, because it still feels a little uncomfortable using it. Ashe. Ashe. Yeah, only if you want to. And I think I just kind of was, it's a perceptual tool for me, honestly, Gaia, as a way to approach this text. Um, because obviously I have some shit to work around, show some shit to work out around conceptual frameworks. So that's my karma. Um, so yeah, I wanted to kind of anchor us into the other polarity here, which is if we're kind of talking about namelessness, I would like to approach the act or the ceremony of naming something, or kind of as I said earlier and like riffed off the chapter by saying, um, the act of charming something or a moment or consecrating a moment by naming it. And I'm just kind of curious, like what you all's experience with names are, your own name. the power in a name, the lack of power in a name, I kind of am open to like opening all those different complexities. And I'm curious what comes up for y'all. I'm reading some of what's going on in the chat. So earlier when Psychonaut said gnosis is specifically experiential knowledge in his perspective, Nobu responded, this got me thinking about how concepts can be experienced from a preconceptual perspective too. Ashe. Nobu continues, like to me, it's clear that concepts and conceptual play take place inside a container of experience. It is clear to me that concepts and conceptual play take place inside a container of experience. Yes. And I feel like for me personally, that happens right before something or right before some sort of truth in my field is crystallized as gnosis. It's like, I think you used this in the example of the why am I like this container. And I instantly pictured a beignet being rolled up in like powdered sugar, where you were like gnosis and like, or some of these hyperdimensional shapes, or these preconceptual shapes have to be rolled around in concepts. And I instantly just thought of beignets with like powdered sugar. Like how they are like rolled up when they're like heated so they can soak it up. But then like the sugar eventually dissolves depending on how much sugar you put on it, just to drive the concept all the way home. Yeah. So this is I feel like this is really awesome that we're going here. Nobody says like I can watch philosophers arguing from afar and be like, that looks silly. Yeah, or like me, I can spend over 8 years in undergrad racking up thousands of dollars in debt, like obtaining all these certifications and still kind of like laughing at the whole concept of university, the whole concept of obtaining a degree and still do that shit and still do it. Okay. That doesn't have to be for everyone, but it was for my path in a particular way. Um, yeah. Oh, I'm gonna read what Psychonaut says. The closest concept I can pull to this is the Lacan real. We had a thread around am I saying this right? Lacan? If we want to dive into this deeper, it lays outside the symbolic realm, which contains language, law, society, etc. It's a really big thing though, and I don't want it to take up I don't want to take up to I can't even read that. That's bullshit, bro. Please say more about it. Yeah, because I have no idea what that is. And maybe I wasn't part of that conversation, so I'm actually genuinely curious.
Yeah, the thread didn't go much of anywhere, but it's so Lacan is a psychoanalyst, kind of out of the 1970s like milieu, right? And he has like this concept of the real, and it's sort of like so in his perspective he talks a lot about like trauma because that's where he's coming from as a from a psychoanalysis, but it's everything that defies symbolic representation, right? So you have the symbolic realm, you have the real, and then you have the imaginary. And the imaginary is where we construct and keep, ideas about identity and the ego and that sort of stuff. But the real is sort of this, you can't even really talk about it because it defies symbolization. But any sort of experience like gnosis may very well fit into this category of something that's terrifying and awe-inspiring and and grand all at the same time in this way that sort of defies that. And he goes into trying to chart out this territory a lot more. But that's sort of the closest linguistic structure that I can kind of put around this idea of the pre symbolic.
Yes, I cannot. Thank you. I was kind of charting that. You said the symbolic and the real and the imaginary.
Correct.
Okay. Mm.
And they're all kind of interconnected, and we all hold these sort of spaces within ourselves, and if any one of them sort of falls out of balance, then it manifests as neuroses and that sort of thing. But that's specifically the psychoanalytic application to like therapy. There's a lot more like sociological stuff and things, frameworks like that um, pull on it in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for laying that out. And that's what was coming up for me too, is this link between maybe not this particular system, but how that kind of like three-tiered way of seeing reality kind of relates to esotericism. And Nobu wrote in the chat, namelessness is also to me core to what it means for a tradition to be esoteric, and also the reason why many esoteric lineages are apophatic. Would you like to say more? Oh, I saw someone unmuted.
I guess, well, I was gonna try and explain it, but I didn't want to speak for Nobu. But that makes a lot of sense to me because
What?
wait, what?
I was gonna say what comes up for you in relation to.
I think yeah, it makes sense because like if esoteric is something that's hidden, and I don't even know, I pronounce it apophatic. I actually don't know how to pronounce it, but basically it's like defining, it's like, I think it's like lineages that define what something is by like saying what it is not,
Mm,
essentially.
oh,
I hope I
definitely.
okay. I was gonna say I hope I explained that correctly.
Mhm.
And I don't know, that's just always really resonated with me personally, of like how I approach names and namelessness. It's like I just have always felt more comfortable saying what I'm not than what I am.
Mhm.
Because there's something that happens, I feel, in my experience where am I like echoing for other people? Anyway, there's something that happens where like once I name something, there's like a diffusion that takes place a lot of times.
What sort of diffusion?
It's like either um it's like, something changes shape. Like when you name something, like what you're naming changes shape, I feel. Which I think can be like, I don't think there's like a value judgment on it. I think like it can be like useful and also not useful. But I definitely think there is something that happens when something is named where it changes, in my experience. But I'm curious how other people feel about that.
Yeah, I totally agree, Anna. Um, and I agree. I think that the name is neutral, but it's hard to ignore, I think, for me, the way that naming something has an exchange of will or exerts its will upon, um, yeah, something that is occurring and existing preconceptually. Um, and I feel like for me, sometimes I think that that's why namelessness is something that I'm super protective about because like my lineages are protective about it. And I think um, it relates to, for me, the way that um, there is this inequity of exchange when something is named and it's super subtle and maybe not everybody gonna see it like that and that's totally fine with me but it absolutely. Nobu asks, did you find this chapter triggering? 100% because I had to like also clear and like create space to process a lot of like my preconceptual spirits trauma. You know, like we talk about childhood trauma. I'm like, my spirit has trauma from like being named and being contained. And I'm saying that cheekily, but I think it's real for me. And so I can relate to that, Anna, where I'm like, I kind of sense that when something is named, especially in the spiritual sense, especially as metaphysical practitioner, I'm like, the moment something is named, especially while I'm still working with it in the preconceptual, feels like instantly taking something that's sacred and turning it into something profane. Like that's instantly what it feels like. And so again, I'm just like naming my karma and like why this chapter was so difficult for me. But it also brings me to chapter 12. I mean, not chapter 12, paragraph 12, where, and I'll read it, it's super short. Hazrat Inyat Khan says, names have a psychic effect upon their owners and even upon surroundings. The names of elementals and jinn, the sacred names of God, the holy names of the prophets and saints written according to the law of their numerical value act as a magical charm for the accomplishments of different objects in life. And by the combination of such names, written or repeated in their numerical forms, wonders are performed. So I'm kind of curious what that evokes for y'all. I'm reading this. Nova, do you want to say more about this? This? Hold on, I'm just gonna respond to it.
Well, I was saying that I was talking to Anna about text and how I spell it as TXT because for me, it's like literally like bridging T, where T is like experience or time. So it's like the TXT articulation of it to me kind of implies that it's really just like bridging different experiences. However, I agree with what Anna and you were saying about, and also what Hazrat Inayat Khan is saying about how names have a psychic influence, because I feel like the symbols that we use to represent sounds, which we call names, are kind of like nexus points of all of the associations that people have made between experience and symbol. And so, like, there's a way that, like, for me, it feels like I can observe a name or a concept from outside of it. And then, if it feels safe, I can go into it. And I realize that when I go into it, I'm in a different container, right? Like, it's a different perspective on reality. And then when I'm in there, I may also find other names and concepts. And if I go into those, then I'm further filtering my reality. And I think this is like the psychic influence that Hazrat Inayat Khan is talking about for me. But for me, like to go back to what you're saying about namelessness and how sacred it is, I feel like it's really important for us to understand that we are filtering experience through names. And therefore, I think it's important to understand that it's, yeah, like we can gain mastery. For me, I took that quite literally, and I take a lot of these things literally in the sense that, like, I can control people with names, right? Like, to me, that's what mastery means. Like, there is a master, and then there is, like, shielding a subordinate. And if I use words and if I use names, then that, like most people who are not familiar, I was like deeply familiar or anchored in realms of namelessness, will have their experience indelibly contoured by the psychic influence of those names to the point where they don't even know that their experience is being contoured by it. And I think it's really important to be able to use names in such a way that you can connect people to their own experience outside of those names, and not only like experience as filtered by those names, if that makes sense.
Totally does. Yeah. And what it brings up for me is this complexity with labels as well, which we talk about a lot in the room, but I think it's coming up for me now in the sense that yeah, like I think it's a commonplace for a lot of people that certain names and labels evoke certain spirits, and if it's not commonplace for people, that's okay. I guess I'm naming it now. And it does kind of illustrate to me even more so, based off of what you were saying, based off of what Anna was saying, what gets diminished when something is when something is being named. And yeah, that psychic imprinting is super hard to ignore. I think a lot of people who would consider themselves energetic sensitives can probably attest to maybe like walking into stores, walking into a room with a television on, and how the psychic energy is, I would say, compromised because of not only the psychic influence, but like the influence of sound on a space. Like it reminds me of when I was younger, how I would go into every room and turn off the television, even if no one was there, mainly because no one was there. But secondly, it's because I'm like, I can hear the ads from the other room and I'm being sold to, and I'm just trying to like read a book or listen to like Usher's album, which is another set of programming, nevertheless, but it's still, I think, true. Too, I think. Yeah, I've even had moments where I've been called to get up in the middle of the night and put a bed sheet over TVs because I'm like, I can feel the subtle like psychic imprinting that's happening. And I think it's important to talk about these things because I would just honestly hate for these senses to go on being stigmatized, because I think their effect is real. And I think even I've even seen this happen in interpersonal circles, right? Where I'm like talking to my friends about one friend, and one thing I say about that friend doesn't make it to that person, but it influences the way that person acts, and vice versa. And it makes me just think of all these even ancient, almost like underground railroads of communication people used to have to relay information to one another without running the risk of that information being encountered by some sort of psychic distortion. Um, and it's so understated. It really, really is. I think people talk about the purity of things, and I think that they mean in a very material way, but there's also some people who are very tuned into psychic purity. And I think that yeah, Hazrat and Yakan really fucking snapped when he talked about names having a psychic effect. Um, and yeah, I kind of want to pause and see what's coming up for y'all.
What I'm also thinking about is how effective naming can be in, like, I'll just say, like, emotional alchemy. Like, there'll be times where I'm like, I don't know what's going on. Like, I just feel really weird. What is this, like, what is this thing that I'm feeling? And then It's like as soon as I have a name for it, as soon as I name it, then it goes away. And I think it's like the diffusion process, like in reverse. You know what I mean? It's or maybe it's not even in reverse, but like I think that just like speaks to the power of naming something, where it's like I'm having the experience in my body, and then once I like name it, then that has an effect on the experience.
Totally. Yeah, thank you for saying that. And I feel like, yeah, I want to hold more space for this idea of like naming things and its effect on transmuting emotional experiences. Am I understanding that correctly, Anna?
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I want to hold space to see if anyone else like finds that a process of naming is super helpful for them. I'm laughing in the chat. Um, I'm also going to read what Julie said. I didn't want to look over it. Julie writes, "What's coming up for me is maybe what I've or humans in general feel as pain in relation to naming is not from the action of naming itself, but of knowing I can't know all the names of creation that sources the pain." Mhm. Which I feel relates to like separation wounds. Wow. And Julie, I'm holding more space if you'd like to say more on that or just maybe muse out loud about it. No pressure though. Psychonaut also says I was listening to a talk a while ago where they stated that hermeticism was primarily inherited by modern day advertising. I'd love to talk about that off the record one day in a different container. So please, I'll just put a pin in that psychically without imprinting too much. Um, Nobu also says I feel like it's also fair to say, in my experience, that when we can use I'm sorry, we can only use names well when we're firmly anchored in namelessness. That aligns for me. Nobu goes on to write, where well means helping people to connect to experiences they've had slash will have slash can have that share characteristics with the experience that the user of names had without inappropriately imprinting on their experience. Ashe. That's nuanced stuff though. But I mean mastery was invoked in this container, so yeah. Thank you for saying that. Psychonaut says the egregore is hungry. Which one? Mhm. Oh, Guy says naming something at times for me also helps with understanding and integrating. And just like Anna mentioned, once I name something, it diminishes. Yes. Yeah, definitely. I feel like I also have to, yeah, kind of set up a little bit of ceremonial space for myself to do that, where I usually am called to meditate. Um, Not with too many bells and whistles, but I am usually called to like get into some meditative space around just like dismembering name associations. I'm a very like wordy type of person too, so it's like part of my process a lot of the times to like release the emotional charge behind words to understand either what's being communicated to me, what's psychically being transmitted to me, what's being offered to me. And I feel like it's also very martial to say that I don't always take or like keep the meaning or the association in my body. I'm kind of like I got what I needed. which is, I think, at the heart of emotional alchemy to me. Adam says, I've experienced naming a strong feeling and it being helpful nervous system wise, 100%. Julie says, I'll say it's definitely a lesson that comes with having a body in this realm that I'm learning to accept and integrate. Ashe. I think for me that's the primary, like, since we're speaking on separation wounds, or to kind of go back to that, to me that's probably the primary separation wound that I sense into for many individuals. So I would say it's probably like, for me at that level, like a collective wound. Yeah. Tygonaut says, I'm reflecting too on how this relates to my disability. Like when I feel something and I name it as something wrong, how that makes the experience a lot worse rather than just sitting with the experience, feeling it, and letting it go. Mhm. Ashe. Yeah. Yeah, I guess I'm just kind of holding space. I see some folks are typing. Y'all can feel free to unmute as well. I'm going to read what Nobu said in response to Julie. Nobu says, yeah, like how a lot of the time it feels like people can only know each other through words. I feel like because in human bodies, for the most part, being at peace and believing that we know something without being able to name it and hear someone use names that indicate that they get it is an act of faith. Oof. Ooh, that's a big transmission, dude. I feel like that's been a spiritual initiation for me personally. I'm just kind of clearing my crown right now. Psychonaut writes, one of my favorite things to do when people are experiencing a really intense emotional state is to ask them where they feel it in their body. This usually takes a lot of time for people who are new to this, but they will eventually pick a part of their body. Then I ask them how it moves. After a little bit of this, the feeling generally goes away because it's no longer the that is the feeling, it's just the feeling. Ashe. I have also had that experience as well. Mm. I guess what's coming through for me right now is like this complex weaving um around communication and like the evolutionary, this is not in the book, this is some of my gnosis, the evolutionary kind of what's the word that I want to use? I guess the shielding evolutionary leg up that we have as humans, um, in the way that our like communication and olfactory system works. And I think that the system that we're equipped with, like our ears, our throat, our mouth, our brain, our body, all these different parts of self that we use to interpret our reality and one another, are inherently like flawed. And I feel like, um, yeah, I'm kind of like clearing something around that. That's what's coming up for me in this moment. Yeah. And I think, yeah, also to speak to the process that Psychonaut is naming, I think that that has been one of my like personal fail safes and also like relational fail safes where just being able to feel into your body. I didn't realize that that was a privilege, first of all, but just being able to feel into your body and name hurt, name discomfort, name these like primary sense perceptions that most, if not all, humans feel can be like radically empowering. Not only empowering in the sense that it helps you shift out of that emotion, but I think the thing with emotional alchemy is like kind of have like gaining gnosis on how something feels and realizing that you can sense it without having to name it and without having to go through that process again and again. It's like something becomes myelinated or imprinted in that internal process is what I've seen in my experience where I can feel disappointment again and after the third or fourth time of feeling it. It's not that I become numb to disappointment, but that I know how to work with it more intuitively or instinctively because I have felt it and that I have that like experiential data, let's say, and like the bank of my Akash, so to speak. Mm. It's me. Yeah. Nobu says, totally, and I feel like it can help people. The feeling process that Psychonaut spoke to earlier can help people get out of the traps of name worlds. I feel like a lot of problems cannot be resolved using names and logical operations on logos, aka names, which I guess goes right back to this, which is kind of like the equation earlier Nobu shared that says I feel like ideas that collide in n-dimensional space can be free in o-dimensional space, where o is vaster or greater than n. How's that for mathematics? So we're kind of coming up to an hour, not to be the proverbial timekeeper, but I just want to hold space and see maybe if you guys feel like sharing or feel it's aligned to share um, what you might be reflecting on as we've discussed this chapter, as we've read this chapter, as we go into the next chapter. Um, what are you taking away from this container?
Thanks for the invitation, Heather, and thanks for reading out so much of the chat because it was pretty lively for this container in particular. um, I guess like one thing I wanted to like shed some light on was just discussion of like letters and rhythm in this chapter. Um, like Hazrat Inayat Khan talks about, I would say like the energetic emanations of like E and I as being receptive, and O and I'll say U or like U as being like powerful. And I feel like it was really affirming. Um, I think like what's kind of interesting for me is like he talks about like letters, whereas like my lineages, from my perspective, talk about sounds, which of course we represent by letters. Um, I'd say often in the way that we communicate sounds to other people, but um, yeah, I felt like that discussion was pretty aligned for me, pretty rich, even if I found a lot of like the other stuff around names to be a little triggering and perhaps not giving like due awareness to like what we've been saying about awareness and namelessness.
Yes, thank you for bringing that into the container, Nobu. I'm kind of remiss that we didn't get to go into the part about symbols and letters and rhythm. Because yeah, like although this chapter was a lot for me, it activated a lot. I felt personally like kind of soothed by that because I'm like, this is a way that I can relate to words and communication. It's usually the way that I do relate to words and communication. So, yeah, thank you for bringing that in. Anyone else? Any takeaways? Psychonaut says going to have to spend a lot of time reflecting on this. Ashe. I think for me, there was a couple of things I didn't get into that I was like wanted to discuss, but I think I might just reflect on. Have to do with like naming ceremonies, different esoteric rituals that have to do with almost like priming the container before something is named, and so that a name can be received as opposed to given, which is really like really popular in African traditions and some other parts of the world. In general, I think, where people have sat under trees on specific plots of land to receive a name for something. And so, yeah, I think that's going to be my takeaway. Da, 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 da. Nobly says, I'm really grateful for this chapter and the conversation that happened in here because of it. Ashe. Me too. Ironically, y'all, I was like, I don't think this conversation, this book club is going to give because I felt so much resistance around it, but I'm really grateful to see how things rounded out. I hope me being triggered didn't do too much. But yeah, Adam says this was very vast. I'm going to be sitting with this a lot, honestly. Ashe. Nobu writes, felt like a real airing out of karma around names and living in name worlds. Ooh, yes. Wow. Aw. Psychonaut said these conversations always make you feel like I feel like dancing on the edge of the void. Yes, preparing a container so a name can be received rather than giving, which is like crazy because it's like the other polarity, right? Where like I was going so hard and being like, when you name things, you violate them, but there's another side to it where you can receive the name from the experience that you're courting. And maybe I'll share some lore. I think I'll share some articles about some of these rituals. They usually happen, just for clarity's sake, in the context of women folk giving birth to children, and how like the moment that their child is conceived, some of these mothers go into ritual space where they're just in communion with their child to be. And usually it's those moments where they sit under sacred land or sit under a tree and they receive the name of their child. So, really sweet stuff. But thank you all again. I'm gonna let Craig the Brown King go. Thank you all for who listened asynchronously. And if you're not in the room already, what are you doing? Bye.